For 2 million years, it did not stop raining, not in one place, not in one season, everywhere, all at once, continuously, for longer than the entire span of time that separates us from the extinction of the dinosaurs. The ground never fully dried, forests drowned where they stood, rivers tore across landscapes that had been desert for millions of years, and the skies barely cleared before the next storm arrived. This was not a climate shift, it was a planet coming apart at the seams. The evidence is still there, locked into rock layers across multiple continents, the same chemical signature, the same abrupt shift from dry red desert stone to dark waterlogged sediment, repeated in the geological record on every major landmass. One global event, preserved in stone, waiting 230 million years to be read. It has a name almost no one knows, the Carnian Pluvial episode, and when it began, dinosaurs were barely part of the story. Small, fast, ecologically marginal, a minor presence in a world ruled by other creatures entirely. Giant crocodile relatives, armored grazers, massive herbivores whose lineages had dominated land for tens of millions of years before a single dinosaur mattered at all. Then the rain came, and when it finally stopped, 2 million years later, the world it left behind looked nothing like the one that had existed before it. The dominant creatures were gone. The ecosystems they had built over tens of millions of years had collapsed, and the animals that had been irrelevant at the start of the reign were standing in the wreckage as kings. But how did the dinosaurs survive what everything else could not? And what was it about 2 million years of unrelenting reign that handed them a world they had done nothing to earn? Tonight, we go back to the moment the sky opened and find out what happened to everything underneath it. If this is your kind of thing, hit like and subscribe. It costs nothing and it keeps this channel going. And drop a comment below. Are you watching this winding down for the night or watching this during your active day? Now settle in and let's begin. Long before the first familiar coastline existed, the planet carried its continents as a single immense body of stone. From horizon to horizon, the land remained connected, an almost uninterrupted sweep of mountains, dunes, volcanic plains, and dry basins stretching across much of the earth. There was no Atlantic Ocean dividing worlds apart, no Pacific shaped into its modern form. Everything belonged to Pangaea, a supercontinent so vast that weather itself struggled to cross it. Far from the coasts, the interior baked beneath relentless sunlight. Moisture from distant oceans could not travel deeply enough inland to soften the heat, and so the center of Pangaea became one of the driest landscapes the planet had ever sustained. Wind carried red dust across enormous desert flats where almost nothing cast shade. Seasonal storms sometimes arrived at the margins, but the deep interior spent ages beneath clear skies and rising waves of heat shimmering over stone. Near the edges of the continent, the world changed character. Warm air drifting from the Tethys Sea fed belts of humidity along the eastern reaches of Pangaea. Shallow coastal waters glittered beneath a hazy atmosphere, rich in dissolved minerals and crowded with marine life. Coral-like reef systems spread through the warm sea, while strange fish and early marine reptiles moved through water carrying far more carbon dioxide than modern oceans hold today. The air itself would have felt unfamiliar to human lungs. Oxygen levels sat slightly lower than those of the modern Earth, while carbon dioxide concentrations remained much higher. The atmosphere hung thicker and warmer across the landscape, trapping heat close to the surface. Even at night, many regions stayed heavy with warmth. Plant life reflected the ancient rhythm of this world. Ferns spread low across floodplains, where water briefly lingered. Horsetails rose beside temporary streams, their hollow stems bending in dry winds. Seed ferns and early conifers formed sparse woodlands in regions fortunate enough to receive seasonal rain. No flower bloomed anywhere on Earth, no grass covered the ground. The green of the Triassic world belonged entirely to older forms of vegetation, quiet ancestors of forests, still far in the future. Among these landscapes walked animals unlike anything alive today. Dicenodonts moved in slow herds across open terrain, barrel-bodied herbivores with heavy beaks and protruding tusks, descendants of a lineage closer to mammals than reptiles. Some reached the size of elephants and dominated enormous stretches of land. Nearby, atosaurs rooted through dry soil with pig-like snouts, their armored backs glinting beneath the sun as they grazed across scrub-covered plains. Predators watched from the heat. Rawasuchians strode upright on powerful limbs, crocodile-line archosaurs standing taller than most humans, their skulls lined with serrated teeth built for tearing flesh. They ruled the Triassic food chain with little challenge from rivals. And at the edges of this crowded world, small dinosaurs moved almost unnoticed. Eoraptors slipped through undergrowth on light legs. Herrerasaurus hunted smaller prey beneath taller predators. Eodromeus crossed open ground quickly, lean and alert. None carried the weight or dominance later ages would give their descendants. They remained fast, adaptable, and marginal creatures in ecosystems already filled by older dynasties that appeared permanent beneath the vast and silent sky. Deep beneath the crust of the Triassic Earth, pressure gathered in silence, not beneath a single mountain or isolated volcanic chain, but across an immense fracture zone, stretching through what would one day become parts of western North America and the northern Pacific. Molten rock pressed upward through weakened crust, slowly widening ancient seams in the planet's surface until entire regions began to split apart from below. The event modern geology calls Rangelia did not resemble the brief violence of familiar eruptions. There were no isolated cones rising sharply above the landscape, no single explosion marking the beginning of disaster. Instead, the earth opened gradually. Vast cracks spread across the crust, and from them came continuous floods of basaltic magma, dark rivers of liquid stone advancing over enormous distances. Layer upon layer hardened into volcanic plateaus that eventually reached thicknesses measured in kilometers. For hundreds of thousands of years, the eruptions continued almost without pause. Fresh lava covered older lava before weather could fully touch it. The ground itself seemed to breathe heat. With every outpouring came gases rising invisibly into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide accumulated first, drifting upward in quantities large enough to alter the chemistry of the entire planet's air. Temperatures climbed slowly, almost gently at first, as the atmosphere trapped increasing amounts of heat close to the surface. Oceans warmed beneath heavy skies. Evaporation intensified across tropical seas and shallow coastlines. Sulfur dioxide followed alongside the carbon emissions. High in the atmosphere, these compounds formed reflective aerosols that briefly softened surface temperatures in some regions, veiling parts of the world beneath dimmer light. Yet the same chemistry seeded rainfall with acid. Fresh water carried dissolved sulfur compounds into rivers and soils, changing the composition of lakes, wetlands, and fragile plant communities already living near climatic limits. Most important of all was the water vapor. Every eruption released immense quantities directly into the atmosphere, while rising global temperatures accelerated evaporation from the Tethys Sea and countless inland waterways. The normal balance of evaporation, cloud formation, rainfall, and ocean return began to distort under the strain. Moisture no longer cycled with familiar restraint. The atmosphere thickened with it. Across the center of Pangaea, regions that had remained dry through spans of time longer than human civilization had yet existed, began receiving sustained precipitation. At first, the changes may have seemed temporary, scattered storms crossing landscapes unaccustomed to clouds, but the moisture did not retreat. Heated oceans continued feeding vapor into the air, and warmer air held still more water before releasing it back to the ground. The process fed itself in widening circles. Rainfall soaked ancient soils rich with buried carbon from long dead vegetation. Wet ground released additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Rising temperatures drove further evaporation from the oceans. More evaporation created heavier rainfall. Each stage strengthened the next with quiet persistence. The eruptions themselves endured for roughly 500,000 years, but the climate system they disrupted moved more slowly than the lava that birthed it. Long after volcanic output weakened, the atmosphere carried forward the imbalance already set in motion. Clouds gathered over lands that had forgotten rain existed. No animal walking the Triassic Earth possessed memory of conditions like these. Every lineage alive had evolved beneath rhythms of drought, heat, and seasonal scarcity. Above them, the atmosphere was becoming something new, preparing the first long descent of water onto a world built almost entirely for dryness. The first storms crossed the interior of Pangaea, beneath skies already thick with volcanic haze. Clouds gathered over plains that had not known sustained rainfall for immense stretches of geological time, and when the water finally reached the ground, the land did not welcome it gently. The surface had hardened through ages of heat and evaporation. Soil baked into mineral crusts resisted absorption almost completely, forcing the rain to spread outward in fast moving sheets that skimmed across the desert floor. Within years, shallow runoff became continental flooding. Water rushed through low basins and dry valleys, gathering force as it traveled across open ground stripped of deep vegetation. Ancient rock faces fractured beneath sudden erosion, channels widened into rivers that had never existed before, carrying sediment across enormous distances. Entire regions began rearranging themselves under the constant movement of water. The physical scar of this transition remained preserved long after the storms themselves faded. In Triassic formations around the world, geologists discovered a striking pattern embedded directly into the stone. Older layers appeared deep red, colored by iron oxidation in dry desert conditions. Above them sat abrupt bands of gray and green sediment formed in wet, oxygen-poor environments where water lingered in soil and floodplain for long periods. The change appeared so suddenly in the rock record that it resembled a planetary shift, unfolding almost in real time. At first, isolated discoveries seemed regional, then identical transitions emerged across multiple continents. South American outcrops revealed the same boundary seen in Europe. North African deposits carried matching layers. Similar records appeared in parts of Asia and North America, each preserving the same movement from arid sediment into waterlogged stone at nearly the same moment in Earth's history. The consistency transformed scattered observations into evidence of a global event unfolding simultaneously across the supercontinent. Inside those rocks, chemistry preserved details invisible to the eye. Carbon isotope excursions recorded massive disruptions to the atmosphere as volcanic gases accumulated overhead. Oxygen isotope shifts reflected rising global temperatures spreading through ocean and freshwater systems alike. Microscopic pollen grains trapped within sediment revealed entire plant communities changing in response to the new climate. Independent lines of evidence all converged toward the same conclusion. a world entering prolonged instability. Temperatures climbed several degrees Celsius above already warm Triassic conditions, while humidity expanded deep into continental interiors that had remained dry for millions of years. Desert pavements softened into broad mudflats streaked with standing water. Dune systems collapsed under repeated saturation, their sharp ridges dissolving into low rolling sediment. Former stream beds stopped vanishing seasonally and instead carried continuous flow across landscapes still adjusting to moisture. The speed of the transformation mattered as much as its scale. In geological terms, these shifts occurred rapidly, over thousands rather than millions of years. Ecosystems built gradually through long periods of climatic stability suddenly found themselves confronting entirely different conditions within relatively few generations. The earliest pressure settled into the plants. Roots adapted for dry, oxygen-rich soils now sat submerged beneath persistent moisture. Ferns, conifers, and seed ferns struggled quietly beneath darkening skies, and the strain spreading through vegetation soon began moving outward into every living system connected to it. Long before the great animals began disappearing from the fossil record, the change could already be seen in the trees. Across the Triassic world, plant communities had been shaped by dryness for immense stretches of time. Their roots spread through loose, oxygen-rich soils built around brief wet seasons, followed by long intervals of heat. Seed ferns anchored themselves in ground that drained quickly after rainfall. Early conifers survived by conserving moisture behind narrow leaves and tough bark. Fern prairies spread across floodplains that alternated between seasonal growth and extended drought. Every layer of the landscape carried the imprint of aridity. The new climate overturned those conditions slowly at first, then all at once. Rainfall no longer arrived in isolated pulses, separated by recovery. Water remained trapped in the ground for months, then years, saturating soils that had evolved to stay dry beneath the surface. Oxygen vanished from the spaces between soil particles. Roots that depended on air began suffocating underground long before anything visible appeared above the surface. Many trees died standing upright. Their trunks remained fixed in place, while the living tissue within them failed quietly from below. Forest canopies thinned unevenly as leaves dropped earlier each season, and new growth struggled to replace what had been lost. Fallen branches accumulated in stagnant pools where decomposition slowed beneath waterlogged conditions. Entire groves became pale skeletons rising from mud. The most detailed record of this transformation drifted downward grain by grain into ancient sediment. Pollen, nearly indestructible at microscopic scale, settled into lakes, riverbeds, and flooded lowlands where it remained preserved for hundreds of millions of years. Through palynology, the study of ancient pollen, scientists reconstructed the collapse of Triassic vegetation with extraordinary precision. At the boundary of the Carnian Pluvial episode, conifer pollen and seed fern spores declined abruptly across multiple regions of the world. In their place appeared dense concentrations of fern spores, arriving so rapidly in geological terms that the transition resembled a sudden pulse through the sediment record. Paleobotanists refer to these intervals as fern spikes, a recurring signature found after ecological disasters throughout Earth's history. Ferns possessed advantages suited to unstable ground. They reproduced quickly through spores carried easily by wind and water. They colonized exposed sediment faster than slower growing woody plants. After floods buried older vegetation beneath mud, ferns spread across the disturbed terrain in immense green expanses, softening the edges of newly formed wetlands and unstable floodplains. Yet the rise of these pioneer plants carried consequences for every animal feeding within the old ecosystems. Large herbivores adapted to browsing established conifer forests or grazing stable dryland vegetation encountered landscapes where familiar food sources had vanished or become patchy and unpredictable. Nutrient cycles shifted alongside the plants themselves. Waterlogged soils altered the chemistry of roots and leaves, changing the quality of available forage even where vegetation survived. New plant communities slowly emerged in the saturated world. Moisture tolerant conifers expanded into lowlands. Dense horsetail thickets lined permanent waterways. Wetland flora spread through regions once too dry to support them. The visual character of the supercontinent changed with remarkable speed, from open drought adapted terrain into mosaics of marsh, mud, standing water, and unstable forest. Under the dim light filtering through humid skies, the old Triassic world loosened at its foundations. Animals capable of feeding opportunistically moved through the changing terrain with greater success, while creatures bound tightly to older ecosystems drifted closer to disappearance with each passing generation. Beyond the flooded interiors of Pangaea, the oceans were absorbing the same disruption in slower, quieter ways. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not separate land from sea. Every river carrying sediment from collapsing landscapes eventually emptied into coastal waters, and the chemistry of entire marine systems began shifting beneath the surface. The Tethys Sea had long existed as a warm tropical ocean wrapped around the eastern edge of the supercontinent. Shallow shelves supported dense reef systems, and enormous populations of marine invertebrates adapted to stable salinity and temperature. During the prolonged rainfall, freshwater runoff increased dramatically. Rivers, swollen by constant storms, poured into coastal basins, carrying mud, dissolved minerals, and decomposing organic matter stripped from inland vegetation. Near the coasts, seawater became less saline than the ecosystems inhabiting it were built to tolerate. Marine organisms rely on narrow chemical balances for respiration, reproduction, and shell formation. Even modest dilution altered those balances. Species adapted to warm, mineral rich water suddenly existed inside unstable coastal zones where familiar conditions no longer remained constant from season to season. At the same time, volcanic carbon dioxide continued accumulating inside the atmosphere and dissolving into the ocean itself. Surface waters absorbed enormous amounts of carbon directly from the air, warming gradually while also becoming more acidic. The change unfolded slowly enough to appear invisible within a single lifetime. Yet, over thousands of years, the chemistry of the sea shifted profoundly. Many marine organisms of the Triassic depended on calcium carbonate to build shells, skeletons, and reef structures. Acidifying water reduced the availability of carbonate ions suspended in seawater, making growth increasingly difficult for reef builders and shell-forming animals. Structures that had expanded steadily across shallow tropical seas for immense stretches of time began weakening from within. The reef systems of the Triassic were among the largest the planet had ever produced. They stretched across broad sections of the Tethys Sea in layered ecosystems crowded with fish, algae, invertebrates, and marine reptiles. Their surfaces created shelter, feeding grounds, and breeding habitat for thousands of species. As ocean chemistry destabilized, many reefs stopped growing entirely. Others entered slow decline, their frameworks eroding beneath warmer and increasingly acidic water. When reefs weakened, entire marine food chains lost their foundation. Juvenile fish disappeared from protected nursery zones. Predators lost hunting grounds shaped by the structure of the reef itself. Species dependent on narrow ecological relationships found those connections dissolving around them. Among the disappearances recorded in the fossil record were the conodonts, eel, like jawless marine animals whose tiny tooth elements had persisted through earlier extinction events for roughly 300 million years. After the Carnian Pluvial episode, their lineage vanished completely. Mollusks suffered major declines across several marine basins. Brachiopod communities thinned dramatically. Some marine reptile populations retreated from regions where they had previously flourished. Sediment layers, preserving these losses, appear across distant parts of the ancient world with remarkable consistency. The same disruption touched shallow tropical seas, deeper marine environments, and continental coastlines alike. By this stage, the planet was no longer experiencing isolated ecological stress. Atmospheric change, ocean chemistry, freshwater flooding, and biological collapse had become intertwined parts of a single prolonged transformation unfolding across Earth at once. The great animals of the Triassic had evolved for a world that no longer existed. As the climate shifted beneath endless humidity and unstable vegetation, the largest creatures on Earth carried burdens that suddenly became difficult to sustain. Massive herbivores required immense quantities of dependable food each day. Their bodies moved slowly through changing terrain, and their populations recovered gradually after loss. In stable ecosystems, those traits supported long dominance. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, they became dangerous liabilities. Dicynodonts had once spread across nearly every major landmass of Pangaea. Their heavy bodies and tusked beaks allowed them to process tough vegetation that supported entire herds over enormous distances. Some lineages had already endured for roughly 50 million years, surviving climatic shifts and ecological competition that erased countless other species before them. Yet longevity offered little protection once the structure of the landscape itself began reorganizing. As forests fragmented and familiar feeding grounds disappeared beneath wetland expansion, dicynodont populations thinned. Fossil beds that once preserved their remains in abundance began recording fewer individuals through the middle of the CPE. In some regions, their presence faded almost entirely from the geological record. Their decline did not happen because they lacked strength. It happened because bodies built for stability struggle when the environment stops behaving predictably. The predators ruling above them entered the same downward spiral soon afterward. Rauisuchians, the towering crocodile line hunters that had dominated Triassic food chains for ages, depended on large prey populations to maintain their own territories and reproductive cycles. As herbivore communities weakened, hunting became less reliable across increasingly unstable ecosystems. Apex predators exist at the top of delicate energy pyramids. When prey numbers fall, the effects travel upward with remarkable speed. Their fossils also became rarer. Across multiple continents, formations rich with Rauisuchian material in earlier layers yielded fewer remains during the wettest phases of the Carnian world. The decline mirrored the collapse beneath them, predator populations shrinking alongside the prey they depended on. Other dominant groups followed the same pattern. Dinosaurs, once widespread across dry Triassic landscapes, declined sharply as environmental conditions shifted away from the habitats their specialized feeding strategies required. Their armored bodies had suited the old world well, but adaptation narrowed by millions of years of stability left little flexibility once ecosystems transformed. Rhynchosaurs suffered even more dramatically. Before the prolonged rains, some fossil deposits contained such enormous numbers of rhynchosaur bones that they appeared to dominate entire herbivore communities. Then their record nearly vanished. Sediment layers following the Carnian boundary often contain only scattered traces where abundance once existed. The pattern emerging from these disappearances carried a quiet precision. The animals collapsing first were not the weakest members of the ecosystem. They were the most deeply integrated into the old ecological order. Their feeding habits, body plans, reproductive rhythms, and territorial behaviors had become tightly specialized around environmental conditions that no longer remained stable. Ecological success had narrowed their options. As megafauna populations declined, the consequences spread through every layer of the food web. Predator numbers crashed alongside herbivores. Scavengers lost reliable carcasses. Smaller organisms dependent on waste, nesting grounds, or disturbed soil patterns also changed in response. Entire ecological roles began opening across the supercontinent, not as isolated extinctions, but as a broad restructuring of life itself beneath skies that still carried rain across the ancient earth. Beneath the towering bodies disappearing from the Triassic world, smaller lives continued almost invisibly through the rain. They moved beneath dense vegetation, through shallow wetlands, across unstable ground churned constantly by shifting water and collapsing ecosystems. Most would have appeared insignificant beside the giant herbivores and apex predators that dominated earlier ages. Yet, as the old ecological order weakened, these quieter animals carried traits that matched the changing planet with surprising precision. The difference began with energy. Large animals survive only when landscapes provide reliable abundance. Their bodies demand enormous amounts of food each day, and even temporary disruption places them under immediate stress. Smaller creatures live by different mathematics. A lightweight animal can survive on scattered resources too limited to sustain anything larger. Seeds exposed after flooding, insects sheltering beneath decaying vegetation, scraps of carrion left behind by struggling predators, all become enough to support life for creatures with modest caloric demands. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, food sources no longer appeared evenly distributed across the landscape. Wet conditions transformed some regions, while others remained temporarily stable. Plant communities shifted unpredictably from one generation to the next. Under those conditions, dietary flexibility became more valuable than specialization. The animals enduring most successfully were often ecological generalists. They fed opportunistically rather than depending on one narrow source of nutrition. If vegetation failed, they consumed insects. If prey became scarce, they scavenged. If wetlands replaced dry terrain, they adapted to whatever new food sources emerged there. Survival increasingly favored creatures able to improvise. Reproduction also changed the balance. Small animals tend to mature more quickly and produce offspring at faster rates than giant herbivores or apex predators. In stable environments, slower reproduction may carry little disadvantage. During prolonged instability, however, rapid generation turnover allows populations to respond more quickly to environmental pressure. Traits improving survival spread through populations within centuries rather than millennia. Mobility mattered just as deeply. Lightweight bipedal animals crossed unstable landscapes with relative ease, moving between fragmented habitats while tracking changing water sources and vegetation patterns. Heavy quadrupeds sank into softened ground and consumed large amounts of energy during migration. Smaller runners navigated the shifting world more efficiently, covering distance without exhausting themselves. Without realizing it, the early dinosaurs already possessed many of the characteristics favored by the collapsing Triassic environment. They remained relatively small compared with the giant reptiles surrounding them. Most moved upright on two legs, conserving energy during long movement across open terrain. Bone evidence suggests elevated metabolisms and rapid growth rates, traits associated with warm-blooded or near warm-blooded physiology. Rather than specializing narrowly, many early dinosaurs likely consumed a wide mixture of insects, small vertebrates, plants, and carrion, depending on availability. Before the rains, these features had kept them confined to ecological margins. Their small bodies prevented direct competition with larger herbivores and predators already dominating the continent. Their speed and flexibility mattered little in stable ecosystems where specialized giants controlled most resources. Then the climate destabilized, and those disadvantages transformed quietly into advantages. The dinosaurs were not adapted specifically for catastrophe. Nothing about their evolution predicted endless rainfall or collapsing food webs. Yet the combination of traits they already carried happened to align almost perfectly with the demands of a disrupted world. They survived not because they were stronger than the creatures around them, but because the changing Earth unexpectedly favored mobility, flexibility, and endurance over dominance itself. If someone had stood beside the earliest dinosaurs of the Triassic world, they would not have seen towering giants shaking the ground beneath their feet. They would have seen small, alert animals moving quickly through dense vegetation and unstable floodplains, light enough to vanish into cover almost as soon as they appeared. The image most people carry of dinosaurs belongs to a much later Earth, an age of enormous bodies, long necks, armored tails, and predators large enough to challenge anything alive today. The dinosaurs living through the Carnian Pluvial episode belong to a very different stage of the story. They were lean creatures, built more for speed and endurance than overwhelming strength. One of the earliest known was Eoraptor lunensis, discovered in Argentina's Ischigualasto Formation, a region preserving some of the clearest windows into the late Triassic world. Eoraptor measured roughly 1 meter in length and likely weighed around 10 kilograms. Its skull carried small serrated teeth suited for an omnivorous diet, suggesting flexibility rather than strict specialization. It could move quickly on 2 legs, weaving through terrain too dense or unstable for larger animals to navigate easily. Another early dinosaur, Herrerasaurus ischigualastensis, reached greater sizes, perhaps between 3 and 6 meters long. It was an active predator, equipped with grasping claws and jaws built for hunting smaller vertebrates. Even so, it remained overshadowed by the enormous Rauisuchians dominating the same ecosystems. Beside those towering crocodile-line predators, Herrerasaurus still occupied a comparatively modest place in the food web. Then there was Eodromaeus murphy, whose name means dawn runner. Discovered in 2011, it possessed a lightly built frame, balanced for efficient movement. Paleontologists consider it close to the ancestry of later dinosaurs, a glimpse of the body plan before it diversified into countless forms. Everything about its skeleton suggested motion, long limbs, narrow hips, and a posture designed for continuous activity rather than short bursts of speed. That posture mattered enormously. Unlike many reptiles of the Triassic, whose limbs sprawled outward from the body, early dinosaurs stood fully upright with their legs positioned directly beneath them. This alignment allowed more efficient locomotion across long distances while using less energy. Their bodies wasted little movement. They could travel continuously through shifting terrain without exhausting themselves as quickly as heavier animals with sprawling gaits. Evidence from bone growth and anatomy also suggests these dinosaurs possessed relatively elevated metabolisms. They were likely closer to warm-blooded than cold-blooded physiology, capable of maintaining active movement even during cooler or wetter periods that slowed many other reptiles. In a climate becoming increasingly unstable, that metabolic flexibility carried important consequences. Their behavior likely reflected the same adaptability. These were not motionless ambush predators waiting for prey to wander close. Early dinosaurs appear to have been active foragers and hunters, moving constantly through the environment while searching for food wherever it appeared. They fed opportunistically, adjusting to changing conditions rather than depending on narrow ecological routines. Nothing about them yet resembled the giants of the Jurassic. They were still small enough to remain nearly invisible beside the fading rulers of the Triassic world. Yet the changing planet increasingly favored animals capable of sustained movement, rapid response, and flexible survival. Quietly, almost unnoticed beneath the endless rain, the dinosaurs already possessed exactly those qualities. The human mind struggles to hold 2 million years in focus for very long. Human civilization stretches back roughly 6,000 years. Written language, cities, agriculture, kingdoms, empires, all of recorded history together occupy only a thin fraction of the span covered by the Carnian Pluvial episode. 2 million years is more than 300 civilizations placed end to end without interruption. Entire species rise and vanish within periods that deep time barely notices. For the animals living through the CPE, the rain was not an event, it was existence itself. Every generation born beneath those skies inherited a world already transformed. They entered flooded landscapes without memory of the dry supercontinent that had existed before them. They fed, migrated, reproduced, and died within climates shaped entirely by instability. Their offspring knew nothing different. The old Triassic world survived only in the structure of rocks buried beneath accumulating sediment. At the height of the CPE, the center of Pangaea no longer resembled the arid continent that had dominated earlier ages. Broad mudflats stretched across former desert basins. River systems divided and rejoined constantly across low floodplains, their channels shifting with repeated storms and unstable sediment. Forests existed unevenly, broken into patchy stands separated by wetlands, stagnant pools, and freshly deposited silt. The atmosphere carried the smell of saturation everywhere. Rotting vegetation accumulated faster than it could fully decompose. Waterlogged soils released methane and sulfur compounds into humid air. Fresh sediment exposed by constant flooding added the sharp mineral scent of disturbed earth and moving water. Even regions entering seasonal dry periods remained damp compared with the climates older ecosystems had evolved to tolerate. The rain did not fall with identical intensity every year. Seasonal rhythms still existed, but their baseline shifted so dramatically that intervals considered dry during the CPE would have counted as unusually wet in the earlier Triassic world. Water remained embedded within the landscape continuously, altering soils, vegetation, and migration patterns across enormous stretches of time. As layer after layer of sediment settled into lakes, wetlands, and floodplains, the planet quietly recorded the transformation in stone. Thick deposits of mudstone, siltstone, and carbon-rich shale accumulated across the supercontinent. These formations still remain visible today, physical archives of a world spending millions of years under sustained climatic pressure. That span of time also mattered biologically. 2 million years is long enough for genuine evolutionary change to emerge through natural selection. The animals surviving the earliest stages of the Carnian disruption were not identical to the populations existing near its end. generation after generation passed through environments favoring mobility, metabolic flexibility, and opportunistic behavior. Even slight survival advantages accumulated gradually across thousands of reproductive cycles. Selection pressure during the CPE remained constant and directional. Animals better suited to unstable food supplies survived at slightly higher rates. Creatures capable of remaining active in wet conditions reproduced more successfully. Generalists endured, where specialists weakened. Over immense spans of time, those small differences reshaped entire populations. The dinosaurs emerging from the far side of the Carnian world carried the marks of that prolonged filtering process. They moved more efficiently through unstable terrain, adapted more readily to shifting ecosystems, and survived within climates their earlier ancestors might have struggled to tolerate. The rain had not simply preserved them. Over 2 million years, it had quietly changed them. Amid the collapsing forests and thinning populations of giant animals, one form of life continued multiplying quietly beneath the surface of the disaster. The Carnian world was saturated with decomposition. Fallen vegetation accumulated in wetlands and floodplains faster than it could fully decay. Dead wood softened beneath constant moisture. Carcasses of struggling herbivores and predators settled into mud rich with bacteria and fungal growth. Across the supercontinent, organic matter gathered in extraordinary quantities, feeding entire communities of small organisms adapted to breakdown and recycling. For insects, the changing world created opportunity. Detritivores and decomposers likely expanded rapidly during the CPE, supported by endless supplies of rotting material spread through humid ecosystems. Beetles burrowed into softened wood and decomposing plant tissue. Early flies and other scavenging insects fed on carcasses left behind by collapsing food chains. Larvae developed inside wet sediment loaded with nutrients released from dying vegetation. Every flooded forest and stagnant marsh became a reservoir of invertebrate life. Unlike large herbivores dependent on stable plant communities, many insects reproduce quickly and exploit temporary environments with remarkable efficiency. Their populations can expand rapidly whenever fresh organic material becomes available. The prolonged wet conditions of the CPE provided exactly that kind of environment on a continental scale. This mattered enormously for the small survivors moving through the margins of the ecosystem. Early dinosaurs were almost certainly dietary generalists. Their teeth and jaw structures suggest flexible feeding behavior rather than strict specialization. Many likely consumed mixtures of plant material, small vertebrates, carrion, and invertebrates, depending on local availability. Insects represented a particularly valuable food source because they concentrated large amounts of protein and fat into bodies. Small animals could capture easily and digest efficiently. When larger prey populations declined and familiar vegetation became unreliable, insect life offered continuity. Beetles sheltering beneath decomposing logs, larvae feeding through saturated soil, and swarms gathering near wetlands provided dependable calories in landscapes where larger food chains had become unstable. For fast-moving animals with relatively high metabolisms, those calories mattered constantly. Patterns observed in modern ecological collapses reflect similar dynamics. Small generalist insectivores often persist more successfully than dietary specialists during periods of environmental disruption. Flexibility protects survival when ecosystems reorganize faster than large animals can adapt. The CPE appears to have favored the same strategy across deep time. The early relatives of mammals were likely surviving through similar behavior. Cynodonts, small shrew-like mammal ancestors, already living in the Triassic world, probably relied heavily on insects as well. Their bodies were built for rapid movement through dense cover and nighttime foraging across damp terrain. The insect-rich ecosystems of the CPE may have sustained these small survivors through the same environmental pressures reshaping dinosaur evolution. Competition for invertebrate food sources remained relatively limited during much of this period. Many of the larger animals capable of exploiting insects effectively were already declining, leaving abundant decomposer communities available to smaller opportunistic feeders. In a world where traditional food webs were fragmenting, the base of survival shifted downward toward organisms capable of living close to decay itself. The dinosaurs had not yet become dominant. They still occupied peripheral roles within ecosystems, struggling to stabilize beneath endless rain and ecological turnover. Yet they continued finding food with enough consistency to survive generation after generation. In the Carnian world, that distinction separated persistence from disappearance. Large predators could endure hunger only briefly. Small, adaptable animals feeding on insects could continue moving quietly through the wet undergrowth, sustained by the smallest creatures thriving inside the ruins of the old Triassic Earth. In the flooded silence left behind by collapsing forests, the ground did not remain empty for long. The Carnian world had become a landscape of disturbance. Ancient woodlands stood broken across wetlands and unstable floodplains, their roots drowned beneath soils that no longer carried enough oxygen to sustain them. Yet, wherever older vegetation retreated, new plants began entering the space almost immediately, spreading across the supercontinent with the quiet persistence of organisms adapted not to stability, but to change itself. The first colonizers were pioneer species, plants capable of thriving in freshly disrupted environments where little competition remained. Ferns spread rapidly through open terrain, their spores traveling easily across wet air and exposed sediment. Horsetails clustered along shallow waterways and muddy lowlands, growing in dense stands where constant moisture saturated the earth. Early conifers, tolerant of fluctuating conditions, expanded steadily into regions where older drought-adapted forests could no longer survive. The collapse of established ecosystems created an enormous ecological opportunity. For millions of years, older plant communities had monopolized access to sunlight, water, and soil nutrients across vast regions of Pangaea. Once those communities fragmented beneath sustained rainfall, large portions of the landscape suddenly became available to whatever species could establish themselves first. The recovering world no longer belonged to slow-growing specialists. It favored plants capable of rapid expansion into unstable habitats. Among the most successful of these newcomers were the Cherolepidiaceae, a family of conifers unusually well suited to the changing climate. They tolerated dryness better than many plants, yet also adapted effectively to the prolonged humidity reshaping the Carnian world. During and after the CPE, they spread across enormous stretches of the supercontinent, eventually becoming some of the dominant trees of the later Triassic and Jurassic periods. The forests taking shape beneath the rain looked very different from the ecosystems that had existed before. Some regions remained relatively open, with broad fern-covered plains broken by scattered groves of recovering conifers. In lower wetlands, denser vegetation formed around rivers and stagnant pools where water collected continuously. Instead of one vast, dry interior ecosystem, Pangaea was becoming a patchwork of habitats layered across floodplains, marshes, recovering woodland, and unstable river systems. For herbivores, These new environments created a dividing line between survival and disappearance. Animals capable of feeding on fresh fern growth, soft shoots, and newly emerging conifers retained access to food. Species dependent on older vegetation continued declining as their familiar ecosystems vanished. Flexibility mattered more with every passing generation. Some dinosaur lineages already appear to have been shifting gradually toward partial herbivory during this period. Their generalized jaws and feeding behavior may have allowed them to exploit recovering plant communities more effectively than many larger herbivores specialized for the older Triassic flora. Young conifers, fern thickets, and low vegetation spreading through disturbed habitats offered food resources accessible to smaller, adaptable animals moving constantly across the landscape. As fresh vegetation stabilized portions of the continent, root systems slowly began holding weakened soils together again. Sediment settled more securely around recovering waterways. Nutrients accumulated within wetlands and floodplains, preparing the foundation for increasingly complex ecosystems to emerge over time. The world remained deep within climatic disruption. Forests still drowned, rivers still shifted, and ecosystems still fractured beneath endless rain. Yet, scattered across the soaked landscapes of the Carnian Earth, the first framework of another world was already beginning to grow. By the middle of the Carnian Pluvial episode, the fossil record begins developing long stretches of silence where familiar animals once appeared in overwhelming abundance. Before the rains, rhynchosaurs had been among the most common herbivores on Earth. In some Triassic formations, their bones accumulated in such enormous numbers that entire fossil beds became dominated by their remains. Their heavy bodies and beaked jaws had once matched the dry ecosystems of Pangaea perfectly. Then, across sediment layers marking the progression of the CPE, that abundance faded with startling abruptness. Above the boundary layers, where rhynchosaurs once filled the landscape, there is often almost nothing. The same pattern appears in the atosaurs. Their bodies carried distinctive armored scutes, thick bony plates, embedded within the skin that survive in the fossil record, even when skeletons fragment apart. Paleontologists can identify atosaur remains from scattered pieces alone, which makes their disappearance especially visible. Across multiple continents, formations rich with their armor suddenly thin during the Carnian world. Their populations contract rapidly beneath the shifting climate. The Rawasuchians vanish as well. For millions of years, these crocodile-line predators had ruled Triassic ecosystems as apex hunters. Some reached enormous sizes, standing upright on pillar-like limbs while dominating food chains across the supercontinent. They were among the most formidable terrestrial carnivores Earth had yet produced, yet the environments supporting them unraveled beneath prolonged ecological instability, and their lineage does not persist beyond the CPE. Dicynodonts endured longer than many researchers once believed. Recent fossil discoveries from Tanzania and Poland suggest a few isolated survivors may have persisted into the earliest Jurassic. Even so, their age of dominance ended during the Carnian crisis. The great tusked herbivores that once spread across nearly every continent never regained their former ecological position after the rains transformed the world around them. What makes the fossil evidence so striking is not simply decline, but interruption. The record does not show a slow fading across tens of millions of years. It shows sudden truncation, abundance, followed by near absence over relatively compressed spans of geological time. Species that once defined entire ecosystems disappear from younger sediment layers with extraordinary consistency across widely separated regions. Paleontologists describe this kind of transformation as a turnover event. It differs slightly from the classic image of a mass extinction where catastrophe erases life indiscriminately. A turnover reshapes ecosystems through replacement. Dominant groups collapse while other organisms expand into the newly available ecological space. The cast of the world changes almost entirely, even if life itself continues. The Carnian turnover is now considered one of the most important biological transitions of the entire Mesozoic era. In ecological terms, its impact rivals extinction events far more famous in popular memory. Entire structures of Triassic life reorganized beneath the pressure of prolonged climate disruption, altering the trajectory of evolution for the next 165 million years. The vacancies opening across the planet were not small absences hidden at the margins of ecosystems. They were the central roles holding entire food webs together. Dominant herbivores vanished. Primary grazers disappeared. Apex predators collapsed. Ecological positions occupied continuously for tens of millions of years suddenly stood open across enormous stretches of the supercontinent. The Earth rarely leaves such spaces empty for long. As the older rulers disappeared into the deepening layers of stone, smaller survivors already moving through the recovering world found themselves entering ecosystems that no longer belonged to anyone at all. The rain did not erase every branch of the old Triassic order. Among the survivors moving through the unstable world were animals belonging to the same broader family as the dinosaurs themselves. Long before birds crossed, modern skies or crocodilians drifted silently through tropical rivers. Both lineages already existed together inside a much older group known as Archosauria. The Triassic belonged to them collectively, though not equally. During the earlier ages of Pangaea, the crocodile line archosaurs held most of the power. This branch included the Rawasuchians, the armored Adasaurs, the Phytosaurs, and the distant ancestors of modern crocodilians. They occupied enormous portions of the terrestrial ecosystem, filling roles as apex predators, grazers, scavengers, and semi-aquatic hunters. Dinosaurs remained comparatively small and restricted, while crocodile-line archosaurs spread across the supercontinent in extraordinary diversity. Yet the prolonged climate instability of the CPE filtered this branch unevenly. The giant Rawasuchians disappeared as the ecosystems supporting large, terrestrial predators collapsed beneath them. Their upright bodies and specialized hunting strategies had once made them dominant across Triassic landscapes, but dominance tied closely to stable food chains became increasingly fragile during prolonged environmental disruption. Other crocodile line groups endured far more successfully. The phytosaurs persisted through much of the late Triassic after the CPE. These large, semi-aquatic predators resembled crocodiles superficially, though they belonged to a separate lineage entirely. Their lifestyles kept them closely associated with rivers, wetlands, and coastal environments already shaped by fluctuating water conditions. Living partly within aquatic ecosystems may have buffered them against some of the environmental instability devastating inland terrestrial communities. The earliest true crocodilians survived as well. They remained smaller than many of their gigantic relatives and appear to have possessed more generalized feeding behavior. Rather than depending entirely on one narrow ecological strategy, they exploited varied food sources and tolerated shifting habitats more effectively than the giant terrestrial archosaurs disappearing around them. The distinction emerging from the fossil record becomes remarkably consistent. The large upright crocodile line predators collapse, while the smaller, more flexible, and more aquatic members of the group continue forward through time. Survival once again favors adaptability over dominance. As the CPE gradually approached its later stages, this created an important ecological tension across recovering ecosystems. The dinosaurs were expanding, but they were not inheriting an empty planet. Crocodile line archosaurs still occupied rivers, wetlands, and portions of the terrestrial food web. The struggle for long-term dominance of the land remained unresolved. For millions of years after the rain, both lineages would continue competing across the changing world. Dinosaurs diversified steadily into larger herbivores and increasingly specialized predators. Crocodile-line archosaurs persisted alongside them in multiple forms, especially within aquatic and semi-aquatic habitats where their body plans remained highly effective. The balance between the two branches shifted gradually rather than suddenly. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not fully decide the contest, but it altered its terms permanently. By removing the largest and most dominant crocodile line competitors, the climate crisis opened ecological opportunities dinosaurs had never possessed before. The pathways leading toward Jurassic dominance widened considerably once the Rauisuchians vanished from the landscape. Still, both ancient branches endured the rain itself. One lineage would eventually give rise to every bird alive today. The other would continue through deep time as crocodilians, survivors carrying body plans older than the Atlantic Ocean. In the soaked ecosystems of the Carnian world, both families were already present, enduring the same storms beneath the same darkened sky. While the continents drowned beneath unstable skies, the oceans were entering a transformation just as profound, though far less visible from the surface. The waters of the Tethys Sea had once supported immense reef systems stretching through warm tropical shallows across the edge of Pangaea. These reefs were built slowly over millions of years by organisms extracting calcium carbonate from seawater, constructing vast underwater structures dense with marine life. Fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and reptiles moved through those ecosystems in enormous numbers. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, that stability began to fracture. Relentless rainfall altered the chemistry of coastal waters first. Rivers carried huge quantities of fresh water and sediment into marine environments calibrated for relatively stable salinity levels. At the same time, volcanic carbon dioxide dissolving into seawater gradually shifted ocean chemistry toward acidification. Organisms dependent on calcium carbonate struggled as the water itself became less favorable for shell and reef construction. The Great Triassic reefs declined across large portions of the ocean. In many regions, simpler communities replaced them. Microbial mats spread across disturbed seafloors, while sponge-dominated ecosystems persisted more effectively in chemically altered waters. The seas did not become lifeless. They reorganized into forms better suited to the transformed environment unfolding around them. Marine reptiles experienced the disruption unevenly. Some groups declined as coastal ecosystems destabilized, particularly nothosaurs adapted to shallow marine habitats. Others endured and eventually flourished. Ichthyosaurs, streamlined predators shaped almost like living torpedoes, survived the Carnian transition successfully. Their bodies were built for efficient open water hunting, and their descendants would later diversify dramatically within Jurassic oceans. The ammonites suffered severe losses as well. These coiled shell cephalopods had already survived several earlier extinction crises across deep time, yet the CPE still reduced many populations heavily. Even so, the surviving ammonites would later expand into extraordinary diversity, becoming among the defining marine animals of the Jurassic seas. Fish communities were changing too. Ray-finned fish, the lineage that eventually produces most modern fish species, began expanding into ecological spaces left open by declining marine groups. As older food webs destabilized, these adaptable fish diversified steadily through recovering environments, occupying habitats, and feeding roles that earlier ecosystems had already filled. The Tethys Sea emerging from the Carnian world was warmer than before, chemically altered, and biologically restructured. Yet the ocean possessed one advantage the land did not. Water changes temperature more slowly than air and rock, which allowed marine ecosystems a degree of buffering against environmental extremes. Recovery in the seas often began sooner than recovery on land. Even the deep ocean preserved signs of the transition. Tiny organisms settling through dark water recorded changes in carbon cycling and marine chemistry within sediments accumulating on the sea floor. Hundreds of millions of years later, those microscopic signals still remain embedded within ancient rock and deep ocean cores. As terrestrial ecosystems continued struggling through prolonged instability, marine food chains had already begun rebuilding themselves. The ancestors of future Jurassic reptiles moved through those recovering waters during the rain itself, swimming beneath oceans, quietly reorganizing around them. Two worlds were changing simultaneously across the Carnian Earth. One unfolded through flooded forests and collapsing herbivore populations. The other spread silently through warm seas where ancient reefs faded and new marine ecosystems slowly assembled in their place. For nearly 2 million years, the atmosphere had carried an unfamiliar weight, a sky swollen with volcanic moisture and heat, pressing rain across the continents generation after generation. Then, slowly enough that no living creature could perceive the turning point, the balance began to shift again. Far to the northwest, the fractures feeding the Rangelia eruptions gradually quieted. Lava still surfaced across immense volcanic plains, but the pace weakened over immense stretches of geological time. Less water vapor climbed into the upper atmosphere. Less carbon dioxide accumulated within the warming air. The engines driving the Carnian rains began to lose momentum. The change unfolded with extraordinary slowness. The great hydrological loop that had consumed Pangaea for so long weakened piece by piece. Slightly cooler temperatures reduced evaporation from shallow seas and floodplains. Reduced evaporation lowered atmospheric moisture. Rainfall slowly eased across regions that had not known dryness for millions of years. No clear ending existed. There was no final storm. Instead, the world drifted gradually toward a different equilibrium. Wet seasons remained intense compared with the ancient Triassic deserts that preceded the crisis, yet the relentless instability began to soften. The climate settling over the late Triassic remained warmer than the modern Earth by several degrees Celsius, humid across broad regions of the supercontinent and rich in greenhouse gases, but it no longer lurched violently between environmental extremes. As the rains weakened, the land itself began changing shape once more. Waterlogged soils slowly drained beneath recovering vegetation. River systems that had wandered chaotically across floodplains stabilized into deeper, more permanent channels. Thick mud basins hardened seasonally beneath the returning sun. Pioneer plants that once spread through devastated terrain gave way to more layered ecosystems, with conifers rising above fern-covered ground and horsetails clustering beside stable waterways. The rock record preserves this transition quietly. For millions of years, sediments deposited during the Carnian Pluvial episode formed dark mudstones, gray-green floodplain deposits, and carbon-rich shale layers saturated with evidence of prolonged moisture. Above them, younger sediments revealed drainage, returning gradually to the landscape. The planet was recording its own recovery, grain by grain, layer by layer. The atmosphere of the late Triassic remained dense and warm. Polar ice did not exist. Tropical conditions stretched far beyond the equator. Yet stability itself became the crucial difference. Ecosystems no longer faced constant collapse from shifting rainfall and chemical disruption. Food webs could persist long enough for specialization to return. And specialization changes everything. When environments stabilize, organisms begin adapting not merely for survival, but for efficiency within specific ecological roles. Herbivores refine feeding strategies around emerging plant communities. Predators adapt to particular prey. Forests deepen into more complex structures. Competition intensifies again across recovering ecosystems. But the recovering world, the rain left behind, was not the same one that existed before the crisis. Many dominant herbivores were gone entirely. Apex predator populations remained depleted across enormous regions. Ancient ecological structures that had governed Triassic life for tens of millions of years no longer existed. Vast stretches of Pangaea contained recovering forests, open habitat corridors, and partially vacant food webs waiting to be occupied. Across those landscapes moved the descendants of the small survivors that had endured the long instability. They carried within them the accumulated pressure of 2 million years, shaped by scarcity, mobility, and adaptation. The dinosaurs entering the post-Carnian world were no longer marginal animals, wandering beneath larger rulers. The world settling after the rain had become a place increasingly suited to exactly what they were becoming. Across the recovering floodplains of the late Triassic, the ground itself begins preserving evidence of movement. Narrow footprints press into wet sediment beside rivers that no longer wander chaotically. Three-toed trackways cross exposed mudflats in parallel lines, sometimes vanishing into shallow water before reappearing farther along the shoreline. In older layers, such traces had been rare, isolated curiosities hidden among the remains of larger rulers. Now they begin appearing almost everywhere the rocks are exposed. The fossil record after the Carnian Pluvial episode changes with startling speed. Before the rains, dinosaurs formed only a tiny fraction of terrestrial vertebrate life. In many ecosystems, they represented less than 5% of known fauna, small-bodied animals existing at the margins beneath dominant herbivores and towering crocodile-line predators. Yet in geological layers, deposited only a few million years later, the balance transforms dramatically. Some fossil assemblages suggest dinosaurs now account for more than half of large land vertebrates, and in certain regions, perhaps nearly all of them. This is not the slow replacement paleontologists often observe across deep time. It resembles an ecological release unfolding across an entire supercontinent. Body fossils, isolated teeth, nesting grounds, and trackways begin emerging from South America, then North America, Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. Pangaea still remains largely connected, allowing animals to disperse across immense distances without major ocean barriers. A lineage surviving in one recovering ecosystem can expand steadily outward into others, following stable river systems, spreading forests, and open feeding grounds left thinly occupied after the long crisis. Among the clearest signs of this transformation are the first truly large dinosaurs. In European rock formations, animals such as Plateosaurus begin appearing within only a few million years after the end of the Carnian rains. Reaching lengths near 10 meters, these early sauropodomorphs carry elongated necks and heavy bodies capable of processing large quantities of vegetation. Before the crisis, herbivore roles of that scale had belonged almost entirely to older groups. Now the descendants of once marginal dinosaurs are beginning to occupy those positions themselves. Predatory lineages expand as well. Theropods increase in both size and diversity, moving gradually into the apex predator roles abandoned by Roasuchians and other declining archosaurs. Their bodies remain lean compared with the gigantic hunters of later ages, yet their posture, mobility, and active metabolism suit the recovering world exceptionally well. Stable food chains are returning, and dinosaurs are increasingly positioned at every level within them. The speed of the radiation remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire transition. Many dominant animal groups in Earth's history required tens of millions of years to spread widely and diversify into major ecological roles. Dinosaurs accomplish comparable expansion within only a few million years after the end of the CPE. The explanation lies partly in opportunity itself. Ecosystems across Pangaea had been stripped of many long-established competitors. Large herbivore guilds remained depleted. Apex predator niches stood partially vacant. Forests and floodplains stretched across broad territories with reduced ecological pressure. The dinosaurs were not forcing established rulers aside. Most of those rulers had already vanished into the sediments beneath their feet. What followed was less like conquest than succession after a storm. The recovering Earth had become spacious in a way it had not been for millions of years, and into that openness moved animals shaped precisely by instability, movement, and survival. Long after the rains began easing from the continents, the dinosaurs continued changing in quieter ways, not through sudden catastrophe but through anatomy itself. Bone by bone, generation after generation, their bodies reshaped to match the opportunities opening across the recovering Earth. The fossil record preserves this transformation with unusual clarity, as though evolution briefly accelerated enough to become visible. The earliest dinosaurs had been lightly built animals, narrow-bodied and swift, surviving through flexibility rather than dominance. Now some lineages begin expanding into sizes the old Triassic world rarely allowed them to reach. Among the most important are the prosauropods, early, long-necked herbivores appearing across post-Carnian landscapes within only a few million years of the climatic upheaval. These animals alter the geometry of feeding itself. Their necks lengthen steadily through evolutionary time, vertebrae extending one after another until the head can browse vegetation well above ground level. Earlier herbivores had focused largely on low-growing plants and shrubs, competing heavily within the same feeding zone. Prosauropods begin exploiting a vertical layer of foliage that few competitors can access efficiently. Forests recovering across Pangaea suddenly contain entire food reserves suspended above the reach of most terrestrial herbivores. Body size follows closely behind. Some prosauropods grow toward lengths approaching 10 meters, rivaling the scale once achieved by dicynodonts before the Carnian collapse. As mass increases, locomotion changes as well. Early dinosaurs had primarily moved on two legs, their bodies balanced by long tails and lightweight torsos. Larger herbivorous forms begin shifting gradually toward quadrupedal support, forelimbs strengthening to stabilize expanding weight across wetter soils and long feeding migrations. Elsewhere, the theropods continue refining a different strategy entirely. Descended from small opportunistic hunters, these predatory dinosaurs become increasingly specialized for pursuit. Hind limbs lengthen relative to the body, allowing efficient movement across open floodplains. Pelvic structures tighten for balance and acceleration. Teeth narrow into recurved blades, better suited for gripping flesh. Their skeletons grow lighter without sacrificing strength, preserving speed while increasing body size. They are not yet the colossal predators of the Jurassic or Cretaceous. Even so, the foundations of those future hunters are already visible within these late Triassic forms. A third lineage develops more quietly in the background. The ornithischians, ancestors of future stegosaurs, ceratopsians, and iguanodonts, begin their own diversification during this same period. Small and relatively uncommon at first, they nonetheless establish a separate evolutionary experiment in herbivory and locomotion. Their jaws and hip structures hint at feeding strategies that will later dominate entire ecosystems. Underlying all of these transformations is evidence hidden inside the bones themselves. Microscopic studies of dinosaur histology reveal dense, vascular canals and rapid growth rings, unlike those seen in most modern reptiles. These animals were depositing bone tissue quickly, sustaining accelerated growth rates over repeated generations. Their metabolisms appear unusually active, allowing young dinosaurs to reach large body sizes within comparatively short spans of time. Each innovation unlocks another ecological possibility. Long necks open untouched feeding zones. Increased body size discourages predation. Quadrupedal movement stabilizes heavy herbivores across broad territories. Fast growth allows populations to expand rapidly wherever resources remain abundant. The Jurassic world still lies tens of millions of years ahead, yet its architecture is already forming here, assembled gradually through changing skeletons moving across the warm, recovering continents left behind after the rain. For tens of millions of years after the Carnian rains faded, the Earth settled into relative stability. Forests thickened across warm floodplains. Dinosaurs diversified into larger and more specialized forms, and the continents drifted slowly across a greenhouse world rich with rivers, conifers, and expanding animal lineages. Yet beneath the crust, another fracture was already forming, deep and silent, preparing the planet for a second upheaval. Around 201 million years ago, the supercontinent itself began to tear apart. The first stages of the Atlantic Ocean opening split the crust across what would one day become eastern North America, northwestern Africa, and parts of Europe. Along those widening fractures emerged the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest volcanic events that Earth has ever experienced. Like Rangelia before it, this was not a single mountain erupting into the sky. Entire regions of crust opened and flooded the surface with lava over immense distances. The atmosphere changed again. Volcanic carbon dioxide accumulated rapidly, driving global warming across already warm ecosystems. Sulfur compounds altered rainfall chemistry. Ocean waters absorbed increasing amounts of dissolved carbon, destabilizing marine environments that had only partially recovered from earlier crises. Geological layers from the end of the Triassic preserve abrupt carbon isotope disturbances, black shale deposits, and extinction boundaries visible across multiple continents and ocean basins simultaneously. This extinction event proved even larger than the Carnian disruption before it. An estimated 70 to 75% of Earth's species disappeared near the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Marine ecosystems lost broad portions of their invertebrate diversity. Several marine reptile groups vanished entirely. On land, the remaining large crocodile line predators declined sharply. Phytosaurs, which had survived the Carnian catastrophe and persisted for millions of years afterward, disappeared completely from the fossil record. The long contest between dinosaur line and crocodile line archosaurs finally approached its conclusion. For nearly 30 million years, the terrestrial world had remained divided between these branches of the ancient archosaur family tree. Dinosaurs expanded steadily, yet powerful crocodile-line competitors still occupied major ecological roles across many environments. After the end Triassic extinction, most of those terrestrial rivals were gone. Their descendants survived primarily in semi-aquatic habitats, retreating toward riverbanks, marshes, and coastal systems while dinosaurs spread across the open land. What stands out most clearly in the fossil evidence is not merely that dinosaurs survived again, but how completely they survived. The same broad traits that allowed their ancestors to endure the Carnian Pluvial episode appear once more across the surviving lineages. Rapid growth rates supported fast population recovery. Active metabolisms allowed sustained movement through unstable climates. Generalized feeding strategies buffered ecological disruption. Reproductive flexibility enabled expansion into newly vacant habitats before slower competitors could recover. These characteristics had now been refined by 30 million years of evolutionary pressure. The dinosaurs emerging after the end Triassic extinction were no longer marginal opportunists shaped accidentally by crisis. They had become a lineage repeatedly filtered through planetary instability, retaining traits that functioned exceptionally well under conditions of environmental collapse. After the extinction passed, the Jurassic world opened before them with remarkably little opposition among large terrestrial vertebrates. Forests, floodplains, and inland basins across Pangaea filled increasingly with dinosaur trackways, nesting grounds, and expanding ecosystems structured around their bodies. Two global catastrophes had swept across the Earth within the span of their rise. Through both of them, the dinosaurs endured while so many rivals vanished into stone beneath their feet. Long before the dinosaurs became giants, their bodies were already carrying a set of advantages unusually well suited for surviving instability. In the shifting climate of the Triassic, those advantages mattered more than size, aggression, or dominance. They allowed certain animals to remain active, while entire ecosystems around them struggled to function. The first advantage was posture. Most reptiles of the Triassic still moved with partially sprawling limbs, their bodies held between outward angled legs inherited from older ancestors. Dinosaurs stood differently. Their legs extended directly beneath the body, forming a vertical support system that distributed weight more efficiently across the skeleton. Movement required less energy. Walking over long distances became easier. Sustained running became possible without exhausting the muscles as quickly as sprawling animals did. Across unstable floodplains and fragmented forests, efficiency translated directly into survival. Breathing likely provided another advantage hidden deep inside the chest. Fossil evidence connected to the anatomy of modern birds suggests many dinosaurs possessed a flow through respiratory system supported by internal air sacs. Instead of inhaling and exhaling through the same passageways like most reptiles, fresh air likely moved continuously through the lungs in one direction. This system extracts oxygen with remarkable efficiency. During volcanic intervals, when atmospheric carbon dioxide increased and oxygen levels fluctuated, animals capable of pulling more oxygen from each breath could remain active under conditions that slowed many competitors. The Carnian world was humid, unstable, and chemically altered. Efficient respiration may have allowed dinosaurs to maintain movement and feeding patterns while other reptiles became increasingly constrained by the environment. Their bones tell a similar story. Microscopic studies of dinosaur fossils reveal fibrolamellar bone tissue, a rapidly produced structure filled with blood vessels and associated with elevated metabolic activity. This type of bone grows quickly and requires enormous biological investment. It appears in animals capable of sustained growth rates far beyond those seen in most cold-blooded reptiles. The implication is difficult to ignore. Many early dinosaurs were likely warm-blooded or very close to it. In wet and cooling conditions, this became enormously important. Cold-blooded animals depend heavily on external temperatures to regulate movement and metabolism. Prolonged rainfall and cooler climates reduce their activity, slow digestion, and limit feeding opportunities. Dinosaurs with internally elevated metabolisms could remain mobile during weather conditions that suppressed many rivals. Even reproduction may have favored them. Dinosaur eggs possessed hard or semi-hard shells that resisted excessive moisture more effectively than softer reptilian eggs. During millions of years of persistent rainfall, fungal growth and soil saturation would have threatened embryos across enormous nesting grounds. More durable eggs offered protection during the most vulnerable stage of life, increasing the chances that populations could continue reproducing despite permanently wet conditions. No single trait explains dinosaur survival by itself. An upright stance alone would not guarantee endurance. Efficient lungs without reproductive resilience would still leave populations fragile. Yet, these characteristics reinforced one another, forming an interconnected biological system shaped through millions of years of Triassic evolution. When planetary disruption arrived, that system continued functioning while older body plans failed around it. The dinosaurs did not survive because they were destined to rule the Earth. They survived because their anatomy happened to match the demands of a destabilized planet with extraordinary precision, as though the violence of the Triassic had quietly selected them long before they inherited the world. Beneath the recovering forests of the late Triassic, among roots darkened by centuries of rain and soil still heavy with moisture, another lineage continued quietly through the reshaping of the world. These animals were small enough to vanish beneath fallen branches, light enough to move silently across mud and leaf litter, and ordinary enough that no observer standing in that age would have mistaken them for the future. The cynodonts had already survived immense stretches of planetary instability before the Carnian crisis arrived. Descended from older synapsid lineages that once dominated the Earth long before the dinosaurs, they endured by retreating into the ecological margins rather than competing directly with larger reptiles. By the late Triassic, many had become small, active, and increasingly mammal-like, their bodies carrying hints of a future still unimaginably distant. Among them appeared the first true mammals. Creatures such as Morganocodon and Megazostrodon lived quiet lives in the shadows of the expanding dinosaur world. They were rarely larger than modern mice, with narrow snouts, differentiated teeth, and skeletons built for rapid movement through dense ground cover. Their diets were flexible, consisting largely of insects and other small prey gathered from damp undergrowth and decomposing vegetation. Like the dinosaurs, their survival advantages began with scale. Small animals require less food. They reproduce more quickly. Their populations can recover from environmental shocks within years instead of centuries. During intervals when ecosystems fracture and food webs collapse, these traits become more important than physical power. A giant herbivore may need vast quantities of stable vegetation to survive a season. A tiny insectivore can persist on scattered pockets of life hidden almost anywhere. Mammals added another advantage. Fur provided insulation against the cooler and wetter conditions that followed prolonged volcanic disruption. While many reptiles remained dependent on environmental warmth to maintain activity, furred cynodonts and early mammals could preserve body heat more effectively during cold rainfall and unstable seasons. In a world where dampness reached into nearly every habitat, thermoregulation became a quiet but profound form of resilience. Many paleontologists suspect these animals were already becoming nocturnal. The great reptiles of the Triassic and Jurassic dominated daylight ecosystems with increasing efficiency, pushing smaller mammalian lineages into darkness where competition and predation pressure were lower. This long retreat into the night may have reshaped mammal biology permanently. Acute hearing became more valuable than vision alone. Smell sharpened. Brains capable of processing complex sensory information gained advantages generation after generation. Over immense spans of time, life in darkness selected for awareness itself. The irony resting inside this relationship is almost impossible to ignore. Dinosaur dominance may have directly created the environmental pressures that encouraged mammals to develop the neurological and sensory complexity that would later allow them to inherit the Earth after the dinosaurs vanished. For now, however, they remained peripheral. The Age of Dinosaurs had already begun assembling itself across the recovering continents, and mammals occupied only its hidden edges, much as dinosaurs themselves once lingered unnoticed beneath older rulers during the early Triassic. Yet survival in the margins carries its own power. The future often begins there, quietly, among creatures too small to command attention. Far above them, the new dinosaur world continued expanding beneath warm skies. Beneath it, in burrows and tangled vegetation, another inheritance waited patiently through the dark. Long after the storms of the Carnian world faded, the evidence remained buried beneath continents that would eventually split apart and drift across the planet. The rain disappeared. The forests changed. Entire animal lineages vanished. Yet the earth kept a physical record of everything inside layers of stone, preserving a history that scientists now read piece by piece across the modern world. The foundation of that reading is stratigraphy. Sedimentary rock forms gradually over immense spans of time, each layer settling atop older deposits beneath it. The deeper the layer, the older the world it preserves. A cliff face becomes a vertical timeline stretching backward through geological history with ancient floodplains, river systems, and vanished ecosystems stacked one above another in silent sequence. At the Carnian boundary, those layers change abruptly. Across regions now separated by oceans, red sediments associated with dry environments suddenly give way to gray and green deposits formed in wet, waterlogged conditions. Geologists discovered this transition, appearing at nearly the same interval on multiple continents, revealing that the climatic disruption was not regional weather, but a synchronized planetary event. Chemistry preserved inside the rock confirms the same story. Carbon exists in slightly different isotopic forms, primarily carbon-12 and carbon-13. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, the ratio between these isotopes shifts dramatically in rock layers around the world. This carbon isotope excursion records a massive disturbance in the global carbon cycle, consistent with enormous volcanic carbon dioxide release and widespread ecological disruption. Oxygen isotopes provide another line of evidence. The ratio of oxygen isotopes trapped inside carbonate minerals changes according to temperature. Carnian age rocks consistently display warming signals. indicating that global temperatures rose significantly during the same interval in which rainfall intensified and ecosystems destabilized. Plants leave behind some of the clearest evidence of all. Palynology, the study of fossil pollen and spores, allows scientists to reconstruct ancient vegetation with extraordinary precision. Pollen grains possess highly durable outer walls capable of surviving for hundreds of millions of years inside sedimentary rock. Under a microscope, entire vanished landscapes can be reconstructed from particles smaller than grains of sand. At the Carnian boundary, pollen from established conifer and seed fern communities declines sharply, replaced by enormous increases in fern spores. This sudden fern spike appears repeatedly across Carnian deposits worldwide and is recognized as a classic indicator of ecological collapse and rapid environmental disturbance. The fossils themselves reveal the biological turnover. Before the Carnian crisis, many rock formations are dominated by Rhynchosaur bones, Rauisuchian remains, Dicynodont skeletons, and armored Adasaur fragments. Above the boundary, those animals become scarce or disappear entirely, while dinosaur fossils and trackways begin appearing with increasing frequency. Time is measured through radioactive decay. Microscopic zircon crystals, formed within volcanic ash, contain uranium atoms that gradually transform into lead over known timescales. Using uranium-lead dating, scientists can determine the ages of Carnian volcanic layers with remarkable precision, placing the event roughly between 232 and 234 million years ago. Even the volcanic source can be traced. Geochemical signatures preserved in Carnian deposits match rocks from the Rangelia volcanic province, linking the climatic disruption directly to one of the largest eruptive episodes in Earth's history. And the investigation is still unfolding. Many of the most important studies establishing the global scale of the Carnian Pluvial episode were published only recently, meaning the stone beneath the modern world is still slowly revealing the memory of the rain. Far above the recovering floodplains, the surface of the Earth itself has begun to pull apart. What was once a single, uninterrupted supercontinent now carries long fractures through its interior, deep seams where molten rock rises slowly toward the surface. The early Atlantic Ocean exists first as scattered rifts and widening valleys filled with water, narrow at first, then broader across the passing millions of years. North America drifts gradually away from Africa and Europe. Coastlines that once touched begin separating with almost imperceptible patience, carrying entire ecosystems with them. This separation changes evolution itself. Dinosaur populations that once moved freely across Pangaea become isolated by distance, desert barriers, and shallow inland seas. Small differences, accumulated generation after generation, begin producing entirely new forms. In one region, long necks lengthen further toward the forest canopy. In another, predatory bodies narrow into faster-running hunters built for open ground. The isolation creates experimentation at continental scale, the slow branching of life into specialized shapes adapted to local conditions no longer shared by the rest of the world. The Jurassic climate surrounding this transformation is warm almost everywhere. Polar ice is absent. Dense vegetation reaches latitudes that today would support only cold forest or tundra. Humid air moves inland from shallow seas flooding continental interiors, feeding enormous fern plains and conifer forests that stretch beyond the horizon. Cycads spread through the undergrowth with heavy crowns and rigid leaves. Ginkgos rise beside rivers in fan-shaped clusters. Tree ferns gather in wet lowlands where mist hangs motionless beneath their fronds during the morning heat. Within this environment, the dinosaurs begin reshaping the architecture of life itself. The prosauropods of the late Triassic give rise to true sauropods, animals so immense that earlier ecosystems would never have supported them. Their vertebrae hollow internally to reduce weight. Their necks extend into living bridges between ground and canopy. By the late Jurassic, lineages such as Supersaurus and Argentinosaurus reach masses beyond any land animal before or since, bodies measured not in kilograms, but in tens of tons. Entire groves bend beneath their feeding. Pathways worn by their movement alter drainage patterns across floodplains and forests alike. Predators evolve beside them in equal specialization. Theropods diversify into layered hunting guilds, some adapted for pursuit across open terrain, others built for ambush within dense vegetation. Smaller carnivores feed on insects, reptiles, and juvenile herbivores, while larger hunters occupy the apex positions once held by Rawasuchians in the ancient Triassic world. Between them move countless intermediate species, each fitted precisely into a widening ecological mosaic. The ecosystems surrounding these animals grow increasingly intricate. Herd structures emerge among herbivores. Insects adapt alongside expanding plant communities, pollinating and decomposing within food webs of enormous complexity. Small mammals remain hidden in burrows and shadowed undergrowth, surviving quietly beneath dinosaur dominance while developing the sensory and neurological traits that nocturnal life rewards. What emerges across the Jurassic and Cretaceous is not merely an age ruled by dinosaurs, but an entire planetary system reorganized around their existence. The rain that once drowned the old world cleared space for this one. From the instability of the Carnian Pluvial episode came forests, oceans, and food webs shaped by dinosaur evolution for the next 150 million years. Morning arrives now with sounds that began in the Triassic. Thin calls from rooftops, wings crossing city air, silhouettes balanced along telephone wires, all of it carrying a lineage older than flowering plants, older than the Atlantic Ocean itself. The final shape of the story does not stand buried in stone. It moves continuously around the modern world, feathered and warm-blooded, descended from survivors that first endured the long reign of the Carnian world. When the Chicxulub impact strikes at the end of the Cretaceous, the catastrophe appears absolute. Forests ignite beneath thermal radiation. Dust and sulfate aerosols darken the atmosphere. Food chains collapse across land and sea. The great non-avian dinosaurs disappear within a geological instant. Yet extinction, even at planetary scale, remains selective. Some bodies are built to endure instability better than others, and among the surviving lineages are small feathered theropods already adapted to rapid reproduction, high activity, and flexible diets. Their ancestry had been hidden in fragments for generations of paleontology before the evidence became overwhelming. In Bavaria, Archaeopteryx preserved delicate feather impressions in limestone 150 million years old, displaying both reptilian teeth and unmistakable wings. Later discoveries from Liaoning province in northeastern China revealed entire ecosystems of feathered dinosaurs buried beneath volcanic ash, from tiny gliding forms to active ground hunters covered in filamentous plumage. Species such as Microraptor, Anchiornis, and Sinosauropteryx preserved feathers so clearly that pigment structures could still be studied under microscopes, allowing scientists to reconstruct coloration from deep time itself. The boundary between bird and dinosaur dissolved gradually under this evidence. Hollow bones, wishbones, nesting behavior, air sac systems, brooding postures, and three-fingered limbs all connected modern birds directly to Maniraptor and theropods. The relationship is no longer metaphorical or speculative. Birds are not descendants standing outside Dinosauria. They remain part of it, the final surviving branch of a once immense radiation that dominated Earth for more than 150 million years. What survives the asteroid follows a pattern already written during the Carnian Pluvial episode. Large specialists vanish first, small adaptable forms persist. Seed-eating and insect-eating birds endure where giant predators cannot. Rapid breeding allows populations to recover, despite shattered ecosystems. Feathers provide insulation during impact winters and unstable climates. Flight permits movement across collapsing landscapes in search of surviving food sources and freshwater refuges. Once again, flexibility proves more durable than dominance. From those survivors comes the modern avian world. Nearly 10,000 bird species now inhabit the planet, occupying deserts, rainforests, coastlines, tundra, mountains, and open oceans. Albatrosses cross entire hemispheres above southern seas. Penguins move through Antarctic water dense with ice. Hummingbirds hover among tropical flowers with heart rates beyond anything possible in larger animals. Sparrows gather in urban streets beside human footsteps, descendants of theropods that once shared the earth with Tyrannosaurus. The continuity stretches unbroken across 234 million years. The rains of the Carnian world selected for a body plan able to withstand disruption, and that body plan passed through catastrophe after catastrophe without disappearing. Every feather lifted by modern wind carries part of that inheritance forward. The Age of Dinosaurs did not vanish into the past. It still circles overhead each day, alive in the sky above every continent on Earth. Along the banks of modern rivers, another Triassic inheritance waits almost motionless beneath the water. Crocodilians drift through muddy currents, with only their eyes and nostrils visible above the surface. Bodies suspended in stillness so complete, they seem carved from the river itself. Their lineage stretches backward beyond the dinosaurs, beyond the Jurassic, beyond even the ending of the Carnian reign. The semi-aquatic archosaurs that endured the instability of the Triassic discovered a body plan so effective that evolution has altered it only modestly across more than 230 million years. Their survival reveals something important about extinction itself. The giant Rawasuchians vanished despite their strength and dominance on land, yet the smaller crocodile-line survivors persisted by remaining adaptable, aquatic, and opportunistic. Modern crocodilians can endure long periods without food, tolerate fluctuating freshwater conditions, and feed on almost anything available, from fish and carrion to mammals crossing riverbanks. Stability through flexibility became their inheritance. Even their low-slung posture, once overshadowed by upright dinosaurs, proved durable in the quiet ecological margins where catastrophe passed less violently. Not far from them in the fossil record stand the earliest turtles, appearing during the late Triassic with shells already recognizable in form. They endured the Carnian Pluvial episode, the end Triassic extinction, and later the asteroid winter at the end of the Cretaceous. Their strategy differed from both crocodilians and dinosaurs. Slow metabolism, protective armor, and broad environmental tolerance carried them through planetary upheavals that erased far larger and faster creatures. Across wetlands, coastlines, and inland rivers, turtles became another enduring thread connecting the modern world to the instability of the Triassic Earth. Hidden beneath these larger survivors move the cynodont descendants, small nocturnal animals surviving in burrows and shadowed vegetation, while dinosaurs ruled the surface world above them. From these mammalian survivors emerged every later mammal lineage: whales crossing modern oceans, bats navigating through darkness with echolocation, elephants moving across African grasslands, and human beings building cities beneath electric light all trace their ancestry back through those tiny Triassic survivors. Their persistence during the Carnian world mattered not because they dominated, but because they endured quietly long enough for future opportunities to arrive. The squamates followed their own path through this changing planet. Early lizards present during the Triassic diversified gradually across the Mesozoic, eventually giving rise to snakes, geckos, skinks, and monitors. Their small size and rapid reproduction allowed them to persist through ecological transitions that removed slower and more specialized reptiles. Today, they occupy deserts, forests, caves, mountains, and tropical canopies on nearly every continent except Antarctica, another living continuation of lineages shaped by deep geological disruption. Seen together, the modern biosphere begins to resemble a registry of Carnian survivors. Birds, crocodilians, mammals, turtles, and squamates all pass through the same interval of volcanic warming and relentless rain. Their descendants inherited the earth not because they were the most powerful organisms alive at the time, but because their anatomies and behaviors could absorb instability without collapsing entirely. The animals that once dominated the Triassic with overwhelming abundance left no comparable continuation. Dicynodonts, aetosaurs, rauisuchians, and rhynchosaurs disappeared completely, their worlds ending within stone layers, now buried beneath younger sediment. Their absence remains one of the clearest lessons preserved in the fossil record. Ecological dominance can shape an age, but survival belongs to those capable of enduring change when the age itself begins to dissolve. In the older imagination of extinction, catastrophe arrives all at once. A mountain explodes, an asteroid falls from the sky, darkness spreads across the earth in a matter of days, and life collapses beneath the suddenness of it. The Carnian Pluvial episode tells a quieter story than that, though no less immense. Its violence unfolds gradually, stretched across nearly 2 million years of warming skies, shifting rainfall, unstable coastlines, and ecosystems placed beneath pressures that never fully relent. This distinction changes how paleontologists understand extinction itself. The CPE was not a single lethal moment dividing one world cleanly from another. It was continuous environmental stress, operating generation after generation, filtering life slowly but persistently. Animals did not vanish because one terrible afternoon destroyed them. They vanished because the conditions that had once sustained them became less reliable every century that followed. The fossil record reveals how selective this process was. Large herbivores dependent on stable vegetation declined first as forests fragmented and rainfall patterns shifted. Specialized predators followed as prey populations weakened beneath them. Reef builders collapsed in oceans, altered by acidification and temperature change. Again and again, extinction moved most heavily against organisms tied tightly to narrow ecological conditions. At the same time, other creatures endured precisely because they remained flexible. Small animals survived on fewer calories. Generalists shifted between food sources as environments changed around them. Fast reproduction allowed populations to adapt more rapidly across evolutionary time. Mobility permitted movement between shrinking pockets of suitable habitat. The CPE did not remove species randomly. It sorted them according to traits that either tolerated instability or depended on stability too completely to survive its loss. This process is now understood through the concept of ecological filtering. Extinction events act less like blind destruction and more like selective gates through which only certain biological strategies can pass. What survives afterward shapes the entire future of life. Dinosaurs inherited the Mesozoic because their bodies and behaviors fit the conditions created by prolonged climate disruption better than those of many competitors around them. Seen from the present day, the pattern feels unexpectedly familiar. The species most vulnerable during the Carnian world share striking similarities, with many species now considered at greatest ecological risk. Large body size requires enormous energy input. Slow reproduction limits recovery after population decline. Highly specialized feeding strategies depend on ecosystems remaining predictable across long spans of time. When climate shifts rapidly, those strengths become liabilities. Meanwhile, many of the organisms proving most resilient in modern disturbed environments display the same traits that favored survival during the CPE. Small mammals, insects, rodents, invasive birds, and adaptable reptiles reproduce quickly, consume varied foods, and tolerate fragmented habitats with remarkable efficiency. Flexibility remains one of evolution's most durable protections against instability. The importance of the Carnian Pluvial episode lies partly in this continuity across deep time. The event preserved within Triassic stone is not only a vanished chapter of prehistoric climate, it is also a long natural experiment showing how biospheres reorganize under sustained environmental pressure. Extinction emerges not as simple destruction, but as selection operating at planetary scale, determining which forms of life continue forward into the next age and which remain behind in silence beneath the rock. A human life passes in roughly 80 years, brief enough that individual memories can hold nearly all of it at once. Geological time does not permit that kind of intimacy. Its scale stretches beyond instinct, beyond ordinary comprehension, into durations so immense that even mountains become temporary, features moving slowly toward disappearance. If the entire history of Earth were compressed into a single calendar year, the planet would form in the first seconds of January. Oceans would condense months before the first complex organisms appeared. Forests, insects, and vertebrates would arrive only in the final weeks of autumn. Within that scale, the Carnian Pluvial episode unfolds around the middle of November, long after most of Earth's history has already passed, yet still unimaginably distant from the modern world. Humanity enters almost invisibly at the very end. The first stone tools appear only in the final minute of the final day. Recorded civilization occupies mere seconds before midnight. Every empire, language, war, religion, and city ever known exists inside a span shorter than a single breath against the full chronology of the planet. The duration of dinosaur dominance becomes difficult to grasp within those proportions. From their expansion after the Carnian reign to the asteroid impact ending the Cretaceous, dinosaurs remained the primary large terrestrial vertebrates for roughly 165 million years. Human ancestors in recognizable form have existed for perhaps 2 or 3 million years. Homo sapiens occupies only a fraction of that. Dinosaurs ruled the earth for a period so long that entire mountain ranges rose and eroded during their reign. Even the reign itself exceeds ordinary perspective. The Carnian Pluvial episode lasted close to 2 million years, longer than the existence of modern humans as a species. Every generation born during the beginning of the reign vanished long before its ending approached. Entire evolutionary lineages adapted, diversified, and disappeared, while the climate instability continued without interruption. This scale changes how permanence appears. Dicynodonts dominated terrestrial herbivore ecosystems for spans longer than human civilization, multiplied many thousands of times over. Rawasukians stood at the top of Triassic food chains for millions upon millions of years. Their extinction feels sudden only because geology compresses vast durations into narrow bands of stone. To the animals living within those worlds, their ecological order likely seemed as enduring as oceans or sunlight. Yet every biosphere Earth has ever produced has eventually transformed into something else. Ancient reef systems vanished, coal forests disappeared, inland seas drained away, continents crossed hemispheres. The stability perceived by human beings emerges largely from the shortness of human observation. A forest appears eternal when watched for decades. Deep time reveals it as a temporary arrangement of climate, soil, water, and evolution passing through one momentary configuration before becoming another. The Triassic, before the Carnian rain, would have carried that same illusion of permanence. The dominant herbivores seemed secure. Predator hierarchies appeared established. Plant communities spread across continents with the quiet confidence of systems that had persisted for millions of years already. Then volcanic provinces erupted, rainfall intensified, ecosystems destabilized, and the world reorganized itself completely. Deep time strips certainty from the living world without removing wonder from it. The planet becomes less like a fixed stage and more like a long unfolding process, always shifting beneath the surface, always moving toward forms not yet visible from the present moment. Inheritance is usually imagined as something deliberate, passed from one hand to another with intention and ceremony. The history written in Triassic stone feels quieter than that. No creature stepped aside willingly. No lineage understood that its age was ending. The world simply changed, slowly at first, then completely, and when the rain finally loosened its grip, some forms of life still stood where others no longer could. The dinosaurs did not overthrow the rulers that came before them. They did not march across the continents in sudden conquest. For tens of millions of years, they remained peripheral animals, small-bodied and ecologically modest beside the immense herbivores and towering predators that defined the Triassic landscape. In many ecosystems, they were background creatures, present but unremarkable, moving through the edges of a world shaped by other hands. The Dicynodonts had already mastered large-scale herbivory long before the first giant dinosaur appeared. Rhynchosaurs spread across entire regions in such numbers that their bones later packed the earth in dense accumulations. Rawasukians occupied the apex predator role with bodies built for strength and control, their upright posture and massive skulls making them among the most formidable hunters of their age. None of these animals appear poorly adapted when viewed within the conditions that produced them. They were successful precisely because they matched the stability of the environments surrounding them. The Carnian Pluvial episode altered the meaning of fitness itself. Traits that once carried advantages became liabilities under prolonged instability. Dependence on specific plants became dangerous when vegetation reorganized. Large body size became costly when food webs fractured repeatedly across millions of years. Reproductive strategies tuned to predictable climates struggled beneath endless environmental fluctuation. The dinosaurs happened to possess a different collection of characteristics. They remained comparatively small for much of the Triassic. Many lineages retained broad diets rather than extreme specialization. Their locomotion carried them efficiently across large distances. Their growth rates appear fast enough to recover populations after ecological stress. None of these traits guaranteed dominance in ordinary conditions. Together, though, they formed a body plan unusually tolerant of disruption. What emerged from the Carnian rain was not superiority in any universal sense, but compatibility with a transformed world. Evolution does not move toward perfection. It responds to context, endlessly reshaping life around the pressures present at a particular moment. The Rawasukians were not failures because they vanished. The dinosaurs were not destined because they endured. The climate shifted, ecosystems destabilized, and certain biological strategies aligned more successfully with the new reality taking shape. There is something deeply revealing in that pattern. Survival, during periods of planetary stress, often belongs not to the most dominant organisms of the old order, but to the ones capable of existing across multiple conditions without becoming trapped inside a single ecological identity. Flexibility preserves possibilities. Generalism leaves doors open. Adaptability carries life through intervals where certainty disappears. For more than 30 million years, dinosaurs existed in the ecological margins of the Triassic world, waiting without intention inside niches that seemed secondary at the time. Then the rains arrived, the old structures weakened, and the margins slowly became the center, long before human memory, before cities, language, or even mammals large enough to stand above the grasses. The atmosphere itself began to change. Vast volcanic provinces released carbon into the sky over spans of time so immense they resist ordinary comprehension. The balance that had governed the late Triassic climate for millions of years slowly destabilized, not through a single catastrophic moment, but through accumulation, layer upon layer of invisible alteration building into planetary transformation. The rain that followed did not arrive as a brief disaster. It became the background condition of existence. Ecosystems bent beneath it gradually, then fundamentally. Forests reorganized. River systems wandered across continents. Food chains loosened and rewove themselves into unfamiliar patterns. Creatures adapted to older conditions continued moving through landscapes that no longer matched the world their bodies had evolved to inhabit. The dominant animals of the Triassic were not weak organisms. They represented successful evolutionary experiments refined across immense spans of time. Dissonant herbivores had survived previous extinction events and spread across enormous territories. Rawasukian predators occupied the highest ecological positions available on land. Rhynchosaurs multiplied in extraordinary abundance. Yet the stability supporting those successes disappeared, and traits once rewarded by the environment became increasingly costly as disruption stretched onward through thousands of generations. Meanwhile, other creatures persisted quietly in ecological corners that previously seemed unimportant. Small dinosaurs crossed unstable terrain on efficient limbs. Early mammals fed on insects in sheltered darkness. Semi-aquatic reptiles endured within waterways, less affected by terrestrial collapse. None of these lineages appeared destined for future prominence, while the older world still stood intact around them. That is part of what makes the Carnian Pluvial episode feel strangely reflective when viewed from the present. It reveals how completely a biosphere can reorganize without life itself ending. The Earth did not become empty during the CPE. Oceans continued moving beneath changing skies. Plants continued spreading across recovering soils. Survival remained possible throughout the disruption, but survival favored different characteristics than before. The fossil record preserves this transition with unsettling calmness. Bone beds filled with once common animals suddenly thin out. Pollen grains shift from one vegetation pattern to another. Carbon isotopes drift sharply in ancient stone. Layer by layer, the planet records the replacement of one ecological order with another, not as metaphor, but as chemistry and sediment pressed into rock. The parallels to the modern world do not require dramatic emphasis. Climate systems remain deeply connected to atmospheric carbon. Ecosystems still depend on stability across long spans of time. Large, specialized animals continue carrying vulnerabilities that smaller generalists often avoid. The same broad principles visible in the Triassic remain active beneath contemporary life, operating with the same indifference to familiarity or dominance. Yet the deeper lesson of the CPE is not simply that worlds can collapse. It is that worlds can become unrecognizable while life continues forward into forms the previous age could never have anticipated. The rain fell for nearly 2 million years. The biological order it helped create endured for another 165 million after that. What seemed permanent before the storms became ancient memory afterward, and the creatures inheriting the transformed earth were once so marginal they barely registered against the vastness of the old world. At the beginning of this journey, beneath skies darkened by volcanic haze and endless weather, a small animal stood in the mud while the world around it unraveled. It was not the strongest creature alive in the late Triassic. It did not possess towering armor, crushing jaws, or the immense size that once seemed to guarantee permanence. If anyone could have looked across that ancient landscape and chosen which lineage would inherit the earth, they almost certainly would have chosen something else. Yet the rain kept falling. Generation after generation entered a world of instability and never knew anything different. Forests shifted. Rivers abandoned their old paths. Familiar ecosystems dissolved and reassembled into forms that no earlier age had prepared for. Entire dynasties of animals vanished from the continents, leaving behind only fragments of bone pressed quietly into stone. Through all of it, the small dinosaur lineages persisted, adapting not through dominance, but through flexibility. They endured because their bodies, behaviors, and metabolisms happened to match the demands of a planet passing through prolonged disruption. The reign lasted nearly 2 million years. After it ended, the descendants of those survivors expanded across a transformed Earth for another 165 million. Their footprints crossed deserts and floodplains. Their bodies grew into sizes no land animal had ever reached before. Some developed feathers that first trapped warmth, then eventually carried them into the air itself. That lineage is still here. Outside city windows, sparrows balance on telephone wires. Seabirds travel across entire oceans using winds invisible to human eyes. Owls move silently through forests after sunset. Penguins gather against Antarctic ice beneath skies filled with polar light. Every feathered body alive today belongs to a branch of life that survived the Carnian rain, survived the end Triassic extinction, survived the asteroid at the end of the Cretaceous, and continued onward into the modern world. The Carnian Pluvial episode rarely appears in ordinary conversations about Earth history. Most people pass through their lives without hearing its name. The animals it erased exist mostly as fossils resting in museum drawers and sedimentary cliffs, yet its consequences remain everywhere. The shape of modern ecosystems, the rise of dinosaurs, the survival of birds, even the long, quiet persistence of mammals in the background of the Mesozoic world, all carry traces of those distant volcanic storms. Eventually, the rain stopped. Water retreated from saturated ground. New forests rooted themselves into recovering soil. The atmosphere stabilized into another temporary balance, as it always does. And in the silence that followed, life continued forward into possibilities the earlier Triassic world could never have imagined. There is something strangely gentle in that realization. Earth changes slowly until it changes completely. Dominance fades. Marginal creatures endure. Small lives waiting quietly at the edges of an age sometimes become the foundation of the next one. Wherever this story found you tonight, thank you for spending these hours wandering through this quiet corner of deep time. May the sound of that ancient rain fade softly into sleep, carrying with it the distant memory of wings that first learned to survive in a broken world.